Hello, everyone, and welcome to this broadcast. My name is Ben Frost. I am the Professional Development Officer for the Northern New England chapter and also one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast Series Consortium. It's now 1 o'clock, so we're going to begin our presentation shortly. Today is November 21st, 2014, and our presentation is entitled, Is It Time to Stop Planning Complete Streets? And it is hosted by the New Urbanism Division. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those questions into the question box. And I need to turn this off. Thank you. It happens every time. Please feel free to type your questions in the questions box, and we'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions, and I'd like to thank all of them for making these webcasts possible as a free service to you all. And in particular, the New Urbanism Division for sponsoring today's webcast. We have a couple other webcasts coming up to round out our series for the year. So you see these listed on the screen. You can also find the complete list of webcasts that we've done during the year on the Utah APA website at this link here, utah-apa.org/webcasts. We may also have another webcast on the 12th of December. We're waiting to hear back from the division that is considering that date, and we will let you know through email and through the Utah website if we're going to do that. So to log your credits for CM, if you're an AICP member, you'll need to go onto APA and log in, go to your dashboard, select Activities by Provider, select then the New Urbanism Division, and then the title of this, Is It Time to Stop Planning Complete Streets? Or you can search by the event number 28898. You can like us on Facebook. We have a number of followers. And we post updated information on the webcasts there. So that's another way to get the most up-to-date info on the webcasts. We do record all webcasts, and this one is also being recorded. We have a YouTube channel, so you look up that link, youtube.com/planningwebcast, and you'll find many of these webcasts there. 2 of them are, in fact, eligible for distance education credit, one for law, one for ethics, and those 2 are listed on the APA, the Utah APA website. And so today's presentation is It Time to Stop Planning Complete Streets? And I'm going to introduce our speakers. Andy Baynow leads the urban planning practice at Timmins Group, a Virginia-based consulting firm. His expertise is guiding infrastructure projects in such a way that all travel modes are accommodated on streets. It would be fair to label him as a pro-walk, pro-bike advocate. He facilitates work groups, stakeholder meetings, and social media engagement for planning and design projects. He enjoys translating technical jargon and transportation issues in ways that promote active and meaningful public involvement. Andy is responsible for APA New Urbanism Division's newsletter and is APA Virginia's Vice President of External Affairs. He will be facilitating the discussion about implementing complete street design principles. Colleen Hawkinson is a transportation planner for the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. She has a master's degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia. Colleen manages DDOT's Strategic Planning Branch, which covers neighborhood transportation and livability studies and citywide planning. She recently managed the massive long-range transportation plan called Move DC. Throughout her career, Ms. Hawkinson has developed and managed an array of diverse projects promoting sustainability, economic development, and enhanced quality of life through transportation networks. Chris Shaheen manages the Public Space Program in Washington, D.C.'s Office of Planning. He has an undergraduate degree in landscape architecture and urban planning and a graduate degree in historic preservation. Chris helps developers implement city regulations and guidelines that enhance the pedestrian experience and promote sustainable development practices. His work ranges from citywide initiatives to small-scale streetscape or open space plans proposed in the private sector. He plays a key role in drafting legislation for green buildings in the district and is active in current affairs to adopt green building and sustainable development standards for the Washington metropolitan area. Chris represents the Office of Planning on the Public Space Committee and the Pedestrian Advisory Council. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andy, who will launch the presentation.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for joining in this afternoon. Let me show you my screen. There we go. So, is it time to stop planning complete streets? This might come across as a question where the obvious answer is no, but what you're going to hear today is maybe we should be asking this question. Maybe sometimes the answer is yes. Maybe some of these terms need to be used a little bit differently. If you're joining in live today, then you're probably either a professional planner or you deal with planning all the time. So the term complete streets is probably quite familiar to you. It's just the idea that you're designing streets or planning streets that are for all ages and physical abilities. So young children should be able to walk and bike and ride in a car. Older people should be able to drive and park. It's the idea that everyone is accommodated in some way. So Washington, D.C. has been in the news quite a bit. For those of you who follow planning blogs or just read national news that has to do with urban space or public space, you see D.C. in the news for things dealing with the fundamental modes of travel, walking and biking. And then, of course, D.C. has one of the most robust transit systems, and so as planners, we like to drool over the transit options in the district. So why on earth would a group like District Department of Transportation or the Office of Planning even consider throwing out something like complete streets? Why get rid of that? I'm not going to spoil the next couple of speakers. We're going to go in order of the names you see here. This is Andy speaking, and Colleen is going to go next, and then Chris will wrap us up. I'm going to leave this up for just a bit so that while we're going through the presentation, if you did want to get involved in the conversation online, Ben mentioned the Facebook page and the Twitter hashtags, so you can also find us on Twitter during the conversation. But we're all planners here, so all three of us speaking, and then most of you logging in are also planners. And so something we deal with regularly is we get inside of an echo chamber where we all agree about, or mostly agree about, terminology, and isn't it great to make city streets good for walking and biking, and we pat ourselves on the back with great ideas. We love our planner ideas. We love big ideas. That's kind of the origin of our industry. And we hate it when a public works department or an engineering department overrules our big ideas. And part of that problem between planners and public works departments is there's this stereotype that planners are the soft side and engineering is the hard science. So it's soft planning versus hard science. And if you have to choose between one of the two, of course you're going to choose hard science. Why would you choose the soft side of planning? So we get ourselves in this impossible situation where planners are painted as the philosophers and public works agencies or engineers are painted as the action takers. And so it's this philosophy versus action. And what we're suggesting through this presentation that you're going to see is that philosophy, design philosophy, can inform your action. So if you have bad philosophy about how streets should be, if city streets should be just for high-speed traffic, then you're going to get bad design that's dangerous. It may allow for some high-speed traffic during off-peak periods, but it's going to be deadly for people walking and biking. If you have good design philosophy that's good for human beings, then you're going to end up with good design that your public works department and your engineering department wants to implement. So what you're going to see on the next many slides are planning concepts that come out of good design philosophy. Our bias saying that it's good because it's for people first, but actual planning philosophy that turns into action. So here's an overview of where we're going to be headed, just to give you an idea of the major topics that we're going to cover through these slides in the next hour. Physical separation, and this is just essentially separating modes. There are a lot of planners, especially in planning academic circles, where the textbook stereotype of a complete street is something where you might have a transit corridor, a bus-only lane, maybe a bike-only lane, a sidewalk that's just for people, car lanes that are only for traveling, vehicles traveling. So everything is completely isolated. So we're going to touch on that and the trade-offs associated with separating the different modes. And then next, corridors versus networks. Just the idea that a study area could be the bandwidth of a single street, or it could be several streets. The next is the mode hierarchy, and that's just choosing who gets priority on different streets. And this is something I think that is important to keep in mind, because we often, whether planners or engineers, we often talk about balancing the needs of everyone. And so what we run into is people think that you can have car traffic be the highest priority and pedestrians be the highest priority. But it's impossible to have both of those be the #1 rated user on a certain street. So we're going to talk about the trade-offs associated with a hierarchy for different travel modes. And then finally, placemaking. This is something that has been really taking off in the news, in planning news across the world, because things like tactical urbanism or guerrilla urbanism are so popular in the news, because it's kind of projects that start small. It can be incremental change in an area. But what's great is when you have a planning department or a public works department that actually embraces these ideas that deal with maybe less than traditional tweaks to the public space. So these are our major stepping points through the presentation this afternoon. And while we're going through, like Ben mentioned in the opening, feel free to type in your questions as we go, and then we'll be discussing this at the end. So now I'm going to turn it over to Colleen Hawkinson.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Ben. So before anyone out there has too much more of a heart attack, I will start by saying we are not going to completely throw complete streets out the window. But rather, I'm going to discuss the evolution of complete streets as we see it at the District Department of Transportation. We'll talk a little bit about why we as an agency feel that we needed to even address, why did we even need to address the issue in the first place, what transportation planning for corridors looks like, and what all this means for complete streets. This could be a word cloud, but it's not. I simply bolded it and used a larger font for certain words. But these highlighted words are key in DDOT's mission statement: growth, safety, and convenience. In the past 2 years, the District of Columbia has experienced substantial population growth to the tune of over 1,100 new residents per month. This increase of residents is from people moving into the district, also known as millennials, coming for college or coming into DC right after graduating from college for their first jobs. It's also a result of a higher birth rate in the District of Columbia. Employment growth also continues, both in the DC metropolitan region and also within the city limits. This map shows the growth of new activity centers in DC. You can see the dark brown areas include the ballpark area, the wharf that's under development now. St. Elizabeth's is across the river, the Anacostia River. So not only are these worthy to be mentioned because they're new places and new activity centers in the district, but also for where they're located in the southeast and southwest corridors, where we haven't seen much growth in employment or population prior to the last 10 years. We know the district is growing. We know that millennials are moving in. Young couples are having children. And we have in place policies such as the pre-K schooling and paid maternity leave are providing extra incentive for these people to consider DC home. We also know that DC is a great city to age in place, and we work to keep an aging population in the city where they can walk to amenities and don't need to drive. Finally, we know the number of school children is rising in the district. Both charter schools and DC public schools have grown every year for the past 5 years. So the question becomes, how do we accommodate the number of residents that continues to live in DC, as well as the ages and abilities for all of our residents? We recently completed Move DC, our multimodal long-range transportation plan. With community input from all residents, commuters, and visitors, we put forward projects that would enable us to increase non-auto mode share, increase safety, and provide choices to everyone. Let's talk about mode share for a bit. This slide shows current mode share for the 2040 situation with our current programming. The percentage column on the left is the numbers for 2010, and the numbers in the middle are the percent mode share for 2040 with what we already had planned before we completed Move DC. The bolded numbers on the right are our mode share with projects from Move DC implemented. So you can see here that we can achieve a 64% non-motorized mode share in the district by utilizing the projects that we put forward in Move DC. To clarify, these are daily district-to-district trips. Non-motorized are walk and bike trips, and then the transit is surface transit, metro rail, will include streetcar, etc. So we'll take a break for the mode share for a second and go to complete streets. DDOT's complete street policy was signed as a director's order in 2010. It was to promote all modes in a shared space that would encourage connectivity. It was to be safe, convenient, and efficient movement for all users. The reason why we moved forward on this was to, as most other jurisdictions have, is to balance the equilibrium of all modes. So in the past, where a lot of planning had been done to get vehicles through from point A to B, we're seeing now that we need to make it convenient and safe for all users. But with the growth that we're seeing and trying to achieve a higher mode split, we needed to come up with a framework on how we would develop and prioritize projects. So Move DC provided us with this framework. We're saying that every street must prioritize pedestrians simply because they're the most vulnerable users, and everyone at some point is a pedestrian. We need to accommodate vehicles and local deliveries, understanding that that is part of the commerce and the economic development of our community. And then we would ideally support one of the following: a protected bicycle facility, a dedicated high-capacity transit lane, or a designated freight route. Now what we could do is offer several modes in a simpler accommodation, but the real goal is to provide that protection and the convenience that you would be afforded in protected, dedicated, and designated corridors. And that's how we developed our complete networks. It came out of Move DC. It deals with all modes, but it does acknowledge space limitation, which is something that we did not necessarily take into account for with complete streets. It accommodates all users within the network, if not within the corridor. So everyone is accommodated. It may just be that one mode is accommodated on an adjacent corridor, and the reason for that could be safety, it could be safe or space, it could be a combination of both. At the end of the day, complete networks are still safe, efficient, and inclusive, just like complete streets. So what does this look like? Here's a map of the future system based on Move DC projects. It shows modes that are prioritized along certain corridors. The blue ones are showing our surface transit, high capacity, streetcar, and high frequency transit. The orange are different bike facilities. Green are added trails. The purple are vehicular. And you can see in the middle downtown area, we have a big purple area, which will be the cordon charge area, something that similar to what London has, and in order to better balance the space allocated in the downtown area, provide incentives for people to not drive their car during the peak times into downtown. We also looked at the Metro Rail and supported WMATA's downtown loop. So here's an example of a complete network. H Street Northeast, everyone is probably familiar with it. It's the corridor where the new streetcar system, the first leg of the new streetcar system, will begin. It already has buses on it, one of the highest ridership bus routes in the district. It has vehicles, lots of pedestrians, and bicyclists. So as we were putting in the tracks for the streetcar, we realized that this wasn't maybe the safest accommodation for bicyclists. So we looked at some adjacent streets to see what we can do. And it turned out that on G and I streets northeast, one to the north and one to the south on H Street, we were able to provide a bicycle facility that would provide a safer accommodation for bicyclists than on H Street. Now, by doing this, we are encouraging and incentivizing people to use these adjacent streets, but we're not forbidding them from using H Street Northeast. Again, we're just encouraging what we consider to be the safest circumstance. This is just a general overview, a Google map of the area. You can see H Street here in the middle. I Street is to the north, and G Street is just to the south. So what does a complete street look like in the District of Columbia? This is the Civic Plaza in Columbia Heights that was developed just after 2010, right when the Complete Streets policy was developed. 14th Street Northwest is the heart of this area, and you can see here we have bike lanes. This is a major bus corridor. We have a circulator bus, which is run by DDOT, that has over 100,000 monthly riders. And we have three major WMATA-run bus routes, the 50 series. And together, they have 300,000 average monthly riders as well. This is a huge pedestrian crossing area, as there's a lot of retail, restaurants, and apartment buildings right within this small area. And then as you move forward, it's a high dense of residential uses as well. So this is a good example of the connectivity, safety, and efficiency that's provided by Complete Streets. You can see here the circulator going southbound on 14th Street with the bicyclists, and this is just a graphic to show some of that bus, the density of bus use along this corridor. So one thing we noticed with 14th Street is that there was still a need for more facilities than 14th Street could accommodate. So 11th Street also has a bike lane, 15th Street has a protected cycle track, and 16th Street is another major bus corridor. This is a very high dense area in the city, and we are able to accommodate a complete street in this area, but we are also able to enhance facilities for all users on adjacent streets. So I think this is a good example of how we can even beef up our complete street policies. So we come to Washington Circle, and this is an example of an area that is we're just working on now. It was a really, really difficult place for pedestrians to cross, but the area around it, George Washington University Hospital is a block away. George Washington University is right there. K Street goes into it, and on this end of K Street, you have a lot of doctors' offices. So you have people who are maybe not necessarily in the best of health who are walking around here, a lot of students. and you had 4 crosswalks until last spring when we underwent a major renovation of Washington Circle and some of the adjacent streets and added in crosswalks that now total 18. What we're finding is that the pedestrians are having a much better experience traversing Washington Circle and getting from point A to B. Traffic, on the other hand, does have backups during particularly the AM peak hour. So we're looking at ways to tweak the signalization so that we can eliminate or lessen some of that congestion. But at the end of the day, we looked and saw that there was a great need for pedestrians to be in this area and to get around in this area. So this is a project that still continues. We're still evaluating the best ways that we can deal with this, but we think that we're going in the right direction. We have more pedestrians at a number of these intersections along Washington Circle than traffic or vehicular counts at these same intersections. You can see the picture on the left is what it used to look like, and people would have to run across the street and then stand on what we could say was a refuge, but really was a foundation for traffic signals. And then the picture on the right shows what it's like now. Wide, comfortable crosswalks. You have the countdown pedestrian signal and ease to get from the circle to the hospital. The metro is also just 1 block away as well. So that's how the District Department of Transportation looked at complete streets, realized that we needed an evolution of it to address the growth that has been occurring and that is projected to occur, and deal with the limits that we have on our right-of-way within the streets. We look forward to continuing to look at this and then seeing as we move forward further into the future what other ways we can tweak it. This is not meant to be an end-all be-all, but rather a way to address what we see are the issues, and we understand that this is it's a continually changing situation, and we will be looking to be on top of it. I'm going to put the microphone over to Chris Shaheen.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm going to talk about what we are doing to systematically, systematically create complete streets in the district, as opposed to just having, say, a specific complete street project that we'd be working on. So I think that would beg the question, so what makes a complete street complete? So there are lots of components that go into that, and then trying to fit it all into a defined space. Colleen mentioned just having sort of defined space limitations. But a complete street policy, really, it's not just one policy, but many, many policies. If you've been to DC, you know that we have really wide streets. They generally range in width from 90 feet to 160 feet. That's the entire right-of-way, so that would include the roadway, the sidewalks, the street trees. That's a lot of public space in which to create a complete street, or to create a really incomplete street. In 2012, DC was designated a gold-level walk-friendly community by the UNC's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. That was in part because of how DC has made its public space regulations and standards more accessible to developers and the general public. And I'd argue that we have incorporated complete street principles into our basic public space permitting process. That's a process that reviews thousands of public space permits annually. So our regulations and standards, combined with the amount of private sector development that's been going on in the city, has taken implementing complete streets from a one-off project to a way of doing business just on a day-to-day basis. So DC was one of many jurisdictions across the country that has adopted a complete street policy after the National Complete Streets Coalition launched their nationwide movement back in 2004. Our idea of designing or shaping DC's streets really started at the inception of planning Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital. As a government town, we are very prone to regulations and standards to create consistent outcomes. So this history of planning our streets and public spaces goes back to when D.C. was first laid out with the L'Enfant Plan in 1791, which called for double rows of trees lining our more prominent avenues. And since then, we have literally had over 220 years to put regulations and standards in place that shape our streets. So today, I'm going to give you some context so you can better understand DC and our public space, go over what our regulations and our standards are that we think are contributing to completing complete streets, the review processes that we have recently put in place to enforce our standards, and then how we are systematically creating complete streets across the city. So first, we just have some really wide streets, and this is because of the 1791 L'Enfant Plan that first established what our streets were going to be. And then we have a highway plan that was adopted in the 1890s that covered the rest of the city that was outside of the area not covered by the L'Enfant Plan. Both of those plans required that streets be between 90 and 160 feet wide, so that's just a lot of right-of-way to work with. This is a turn-of-the-century photo of K Street, which is one of our widest streets. It's at 150 feet. In the 19th century, these wide streets, they were just a real maintenance headache, and in 1870, the city started designating up to half of every street as parkland. That's an area that we call parking, and it's a confusing term today because most people think it's referring to car parking, but it really means parkland. This area was planted with grass. It was turned over to the adjacent property owner to maintain. So the area, it looked like a front yard, but it was really part of the right-of-way, and it's regulated as parkland. This began a tradition of DC using streets as parks, and if you know this, you can see how it's reflected in a lot of our regulations. When we don't manage our public space, we really suffer. This entire paved area, all the way from the building here all the way to the curb, this is all public space. This is along New Jersey Avenue. It's another one of our 150-plus wide streets. The sidewalk here is 50 feet wide between the curb and the property line. When it's a hot day in DC, when it gets up to 95 degrees and it's 80% humidity, this is really not a pleasant experience for a pedestrian or for someone waiting for a bus. And poor pedestrian experiences happen at all different scales. I mean, the other was one extreme, but this privacy fence, this is entirely in public space. So public space here is literally from this building front all the way to the curb over here. It creates a blind spot. It makes pedestrians feel uncomfortable, and pedestrians typically won't walk up along a fence like this, at least 3 feet along the fence. So it's effectively reducing the width of the sidewalk. This is all just to say we have a lot of public space, and if we don't effectively manage it, it can be a real problem, and it can be really unpleasant for a lot of people. Colleen went over some numbers, but we have a really diverse group of users that we need to accommodate in our streets. We have thousands of pedestrians, cars, bikes, and transit trips every day, people of all ages, a wide range of mobility. Almost 40% of all commutes to work in DC are on transit, and 16% of all of these commutes are biking or walking. Our streets and public space are improved not just by public sector streetscape projects, but also by private sector development. Colleen mentioned how fast we're growing in the population. I think it's 1,100 a month. So we basically added 60,000 residents to DC since 2000. That's a significant amount of growth. And every dot on this map represents a new development project that's either completed or under construction since 2000. So we've had a big population increase as well as a big development boom. The blue dots are projects that are either planned or proposed. And you can see most of this development is centered in the downtown. This, if you've been to DC, here's the National Mall, so this is just north of the downtown. But these projects are happening all across the city, although some areas you can see like entire neighborhoods are basically being rebuilt, not just the private property, but the public space that's associated with those buildings. Each of these projects represents some change to public space, whether it's a total rebuild of the sidewalk or just a small modification. I mentioned before we have thousands of public space permits we review annually. Literally, it's over 6,000 public space permits that our Department of Transportation office permits annually. That's a lot of opportunities for us to improve our streets. And when we get our review processes right and when we enforce our regulations, we can create some really great pedestrian spaces that make people want to walk and get out of their cars. So over the last 8 years, we have made tremendous strides in relearning our public space regulations, adopting new standards to address 21st century issues, and putting review processes in place to make sure that we are consistently creating streets that look like these. Now, our regulations and review processes. This part that goes into the regulations is a little dense, but I think this is important. This is how we're actually doing the work that's creating our complete streets. We have a lot of regulations and standards, and they've been put in place over a long period of time, and it took us months to track them all down, and some are more helpful than others. So I mentioned that we have some of our streets rights-of-way were turned into parkland in 1870. Well, that's a regulation that's still useful today. It helps create a more pedestrian-friendly environment. It helps us with sustainability and reducing paving. And it was mentioned before, my background's in historic preservation, so doing some of this research was right up my alley. It was really helpful going through and doing the research to find all these regs. But now, some of the regulations that we have in the books, they're not so helpful. So, for example, we still have a regulation on our books that talks about regulating droves of animals on our streets, including sheep, swine, and beeves. I wasn't even sure what a beeves was, but like specifically, all of these animals can't be driven through our streets between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. I mean, that's a regulation that we still have in D.C. And it's not happening, so it's easy to enforce. But my point is, even though some of these regulations may seem dated, they were adopted and put in place at a time when our cities were arguably more pedestrian-friendly and one could say more complete. These regulations, I said, they're scattered all over the place. They're in different parts of our municipal code. We found some regulations that help us in zoning. There's some in our construction code, and then some in, it's called Title 24. It's our public space and safety regulations. Other standards are adopted as part of DDOT's Design and Engineering Manual. Some streetscape regulations are included in small area plans, and others are just part of special initiatives that the city has going on. Taken together, all of these regulations and standards can really produce great outcomes, but you really have to understand them and how they all work together, which isn't really always clear when they're scattered all over the place. These regulations have evolved over a long time, but at their core there are some really basic principles that are being followed. They're intended to maintain a general openness along our city streets. They create and frame long view corridors, like looking toward the Capitol Dome down Pennsylvania Avenue, or at a neighborhood scale, it could be framing the view to a school or a library. All of these standards and regulations create a really consistent identity for the city, so it's really obvious when you drive from D.C. into Maryland if you cross, it's Western Avenue or Eastern Avenue or Southern Avenue. Those are the straight, long streets that define the triangle that's the district. Once you cross that going from D.C. into Maryland, you know instantly that you are in a different jurisdiction just by how the public space is designed. More recently, we've had a big push to create more walkable neighborhoods and to incorporate more sustainable practices in the public space. And like I said before, what we found is that enforcing some of the regulations that we've had on the books for over 100 years are actually helping us address 21st century goals of creating walkable streets and improving environmental performance. So I'm going to go over some of these regs. I mentioned before that part of our street of right-of-way is parkland, so let me go over that because it's a pretty important part of our public space regulations, and as far as we know, it's something that's really peculiar to D.C. We haven't come across any other jurisdiction that has this. So if anyone out there knows of another city that has this, we'd be really interested to find out. So the area of right-of-way that's parkland that we call public parking, it's the area between the sidewalk and the property line that's shown here in red. So unlike other parts of our park system that's maintained by a park agency like the Department of Parks and Recreation, parking is part of the park system that is regulated by DDOT, and it's maintained by property owners and residents. So in other words, all property owners have a responsibility to maintain part of our park system. And some of those regulations include limiting how much paving can go in that area. So lead walks, which are these little walks going from the sidewalk to the front door, those are supposed to be limited to 6 feet. Fences can only be 42 inches high. They're supposed to be predominantly open. There are limits on how high a hedge or a retaining wall can be. Overall, the regulations just make sure that that area stays landscaped and it's visually accessible to the general public. So as the city developed into the early 20th century, this parking system was expanded to outlying suburbs through what we call building restriction lines. So this predates zoning. So these were building restrictions that sort of defined a street wall back from what a property line, something that would be in zoning today. So again, this red area is public space, and the adjacent area in yellow is private property within this building restriction line. But what's curious here is that our public space regulations apply to both the public space and the private property that has this building restriction line. So these building restriction areas, they were first proposed in 1900 as a way to help the city implement this highway plan, the second street plan that came after the land plan. What it allowed the city to do was effectively have these 90-foot wide streets, but we didn't have to acquire as much land to create that envelope that we needed to define that amount of space. Another place, well, I guess probably the largest place in terms of setting the most important in terms of setting the context for what our regulations would be is the comprehensive plan, which sets the tone for all of the public space and the transportation policies in the city. So our regulations and standards are created to achieve the goals that are defined here in the comprehensive plan. This includes urban design standards for streetscapes and public safety and complete and seamless transportation networks. The policies in the comprehensive plan, they often give us the intent or justification that we need to defend a regulation or standard, which are typically more cut and dry, and they don't provide much context for why they were adopted. The mother lode of all of our public space regulations and standards are in DC Municipal Regulation Title 24, Public Space and Safety, and in DDOT's Design and Engineering Manual. These two documents include regulations and standards that cover almost everything you could think of: sidewalk widths, tree spacing, street light spacing, standards for low-impact development, special paving, bending, fence and wall heights, paving of the public parking. I mean, the list goes on, and pretty much if you can think of something that goes in the public space, we very likely have a regulation or a standard that covers that. The construction code is another set of regulations which defines how different elements of a building can project into public space, things like steps, porches, bay windows, show windows, or marquees. Now, from the perspective of creating a quality streetscape, these regulations shape the walls that line and define our streets. The regulations add to the visual quality of the public space. They help create a more pedestrian scale by breaking down what would otherwise be a flat facade. But they also make sure that projections don't limit future uses of public space by making sure there's enough distance from that projection to the curb. So, for example, there was on some streets there's a limit that you can't have a projection that comes closer to 10 feet from a curb. That would include, say, a standard 4-foot tree box and a 6-foot sidewalk. But there's a predetermined distance that we know we need to maintain as open for future uses of public space. Now, I know this is a little hard to read, but this is the table that we use to determine how far projections can extend in the public space, and the parameters that we use to make the determination. And those parameters include how wide a street is and how much of that public parking, that green space, is there. So just to explain what you're looking at here, this column on the left side indicates the different types of building projections we allow. So areaways or bay windows would just be two examples. And then across the top, these are the different factors you have to take into consideration to determine how far a projection can go out. So zoning plays a role, how wide the street is, and how much of that parking is, so that landscape area. So if the street is narrower, sometimes you can't have a projection at all. If the street is over 70 feet wide, you can have a certain distance. In this case, this areaway can go 6.5 feet. If you have a lot of that green space, if you've got 20 feet or more, you can go further out in the public space. So these reinforce the importance of projections in creating that high-quality street wall, but maintaining that adequate public space for pedestrians and other uses. Another place which was sort of unexpected where we found some regulations that were actually helping us were in zoning, and I say it's unexpected because zoning very clearly applies to private property. It does not apply to public space. But we came across some regulations for curb cuts that also helped us improve the design of our public spaces. So the images on the left, these show it's site plans for properties. The purple is buildings. The red areas are that building restriction area or the building setback area where our regulations say you can't park your car there. Just as an example, as one regulation, you can't park there. So part of the intent behind that is that area is supposed to be parkland. It's part of our park system, so we don't want something like a car blocking those view corridors on our streets. Zoning also defines minimum and maximum widths of driveways, the distance between residential driveways, and when driveways have to be shared. And by shared, I mean when two adjacent properties have to use one driveway that leads to parking spaces for two separate properties. And that's what's shown here on the right. This is just a site plan showing Lot A, Lot B. Here's the property line between the two. They have to share one driveway. And you can see in the pictures here how that would work out in a practical space. What that does for us is it limits the amount of paving that's crossing the public space, so there's more landscape area. It gives us more space for planting street trees, and it limits the number of conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles. So we're constantly seeing new uses added to public spaces, uses that we wouldn't have even imagined of 10 years ago, and we're always developing new policies and standards for our streets. So this is an example. It's over 50 years ago, but some things never change, and how we adapt to change is one of those things that doesn't change. But when sidewalk cafes first came to DC, or we were discussing having sidewalk cafes back in, the discussion started in 1960, they were really controversial, and it raised questions ranging from how healthy it would be to eat food outside and whether or not sidewalk cafes would promote prostitution. I mean, there were all of these crazy arguments that were being made. But today, we have regulations and standards that have been in place for decades and include design requirements for cafes that we think create vital and active streets. So there are limits on how high fences and planters can go around cafes. They can only go up to 36 inches. Enclosed cafes have to have operable windows that are open during the day. We have minimum sidewalk widths around cafes that have to be maintained for pedestrians, street trees, and other amenities. And just in the last 10 years, we have had to develop new standards for public space that address just a couple I can think of: bike share stations, food trucks, and low-impact development. And low-impact development is something that's becoming a requirement here in the district, both through a green area ratio, which is part of our zoning code, and then our stormwater regulations that we've needed to comply with our federal stormwater permit that applies specifically to public space. So that's a lot of regulations and a lot of standards to have, and You can see they're all in a lot of different places. So what we did, I guess this is now going on 5 years ago, was we consolidated all of these regulations into one user-friendly design manual that makes their intent clear. And we've rolled out an education program to government agencies responsible for enforcing the regulations. We've gone to developers, we've gone to community groups. We've even held walking tours for the general public that focused on the history of our public space and the importance of our public space regulations. And people actually came and attended these walking tours, like a lot of people. Like one time we had 30 people at a walking tour that was publicized as promoting the city's public space regulations. So people are, interested in this kind of stuff, and they care because it really impacts the quality of life in the city. We've created new and took advantage of existing review processes to enforce these regulations. We started meeting with developers earlier in their design process in what we call pre-design meetings. Prior to having these pre-design meetings, developers made getting their public space permits the last stop before beginning construction, and that made it really difficult for us to get changes in their plans. In those meetings, we've included our Urban Forestry Administration, our ADA coordinator, our pedestrian program coordinator, our bike program coordinator, just to name a few, that come to these meetings, and we actually work through issues with the applicant to make sure that all of these regulations and standards are getting followed. We also started requiring more applications go to our Public Space Committee. I think this is also something that may be peculiar to DC. But we have a 5-member panel that is made up of government agencies that review public space applications that are either required by regulation. For example, all sidewalk cafes have to go to the Public Space Committee, and that's what the picture is here on the screen. Or because their plan includes something that doesn't comply with a regulation. So I said before, our fences can go up to 42 inches. Well, if you want a 6-foot fence in public space, you have to go to this committee to get it approved, or more likely not approved. We've also created an online public space permitting program to make it easier for applicants to apply and get comments from reviewers. And I know this is also hard to read, but I just wanted to show you in general how this online site works. So what you're looking at here, this area up here, once someone uploads an application, this is just some basic information about the applicant. All the different reviewers get identified that need to review their plans. The plans get sent out. It tells you when it got sent out. It tells you when the comments are due, who the reviewer is, what the status of their review is, and then this is what the comments are. So from a reviewer standpoint, it's really helpful because you can make sure that the comments that you're giving aren't conflicting with someone else. And I say that because we do have a lot of regulations, we have a lot of standards, we do have a finite amount of space, and it's not always so cut and dry what the solution is, and sometimes there needs to be some discussion among staff to figure out what it is that we want to be clear and specific with an applicant. And then just this bottom part here, this just shows all the different types of plans that the applicant uploads that we review. And as reviewers put in comments, there is an email that's automatically sent to the contact person for the applicant so they can see what the comments are as they're coming in. So through these review processes that we either put in place or bolstered, we started to see results in our streetscape plans immediately. So this is just one example of a before and after. If you've ever been to our Capitol Hill neighborhood, this is in Capitol Hill. It's a nice turn of the 20th century neighborhood. Victorians, nice pedestrian scale, great tree canopy. When this applicant first came to us, it's for a church. You can see originally they had 20 feet of concrete for a sidewalk from the property line to the curb. All of this right here. So you can see here we worked with them to narrow the sidewalk to just 6 feet, which is more consistent with, well, it is consistent with what's happening on the rest of the block. We required them to remove this curb cut, which went to an underground parking lot, to an alley. They had an alley, so there was no need for them to access from the street. All of this green space here, which is that parkland area, was restored. It had not been there before, or it had been there before. It had been taken out with the development that the church was replacing. We were basically putting it back here. We added a continuous tree box at the curb, which the applicant had not initially proposed. And then for good measure, we added bike racks that had not been proposed. And the church wanted to drop off in front, so we had them include an ADA ramp to make it easier for people getting out of the car and going into the church that might have mobility issues. This was a night and day example of how just what came in the door up here, and in the past very likely would have been approved, to showing what the impact is and just going through our review process and consistently applying the regulations that we have on the books. So now I'm going to run through a few slides that show a typical DC street, and you'll see how there are how they really are the product of our public space regulations. Pedestrian-friendly streets don't just happen on their own, but by defining public space at the curb, right-sizing sidewalk width, restoring our park system, and managing building projections, we are maintaining that pedestrian scale on our streets. So this is a typical downtown street where we have consistent street trees and tree boxes at the curb, a standard 16-foot sidewalk in the downtown, and limited building projections. In this case, it's the awnings on the building. On this typical neighborhood commercial street, we have evenly spaced trees at the curb, a standard 10-foot clear sidewalk. Extra space outside that 10 feet can be used for sidewalk cafes or displaying merchandise, and show window projections. On a residential street, the park-like character is created by longer tree boxes at the curb and a 6-foot sidewalk. You can see the importance of limiting fence heights and requiring them to be 50% open, limiting the paving between the sidewalk and the building entrances, and the decorative bay window projections. And here on a street of single-family homes, the continuous tree boxes and sidewalks, the consistent height of hedges and fences and retaining walls, ample landscaping and decorative projections like porches. Altogether, these public space regulations create an identity for the city that really, like I said before, distinguishes it from other jurisdictions. So now, in some areas, we are using public space to redefine neighborhoods, like Noma, which is one area that's being transformed by new development. This is a map of Noma on the right. It's just north of our main train station, Union Station, if you've been to DC, and then here's the Capitol building in the distance. This is actually looking south. This area had previously been rail yards, but it's being redeveloped into a mixed-use neighborhood of 12-story buildings. So on the left are the landscape standards that we developed for Noma ahead of the development, which included 30-foot sidewalks that line First Street, which is right here. It's the main street that goes through Noma. These guidelines included widths for curbside tree boxes and sidewalks. It set aside areas for LID and sidewalk cafes, and it defined what the material palette for the street for the sidewalks needed to be. All of the streetscape that's going into this area is being constructed by the private sector, but it's going through our review process and it's following these guidelines. So these images show examples of the different guidelines for the different types of streets in Noma. This area, it lacked parks, so we used the unusually wide rights-of-way to create new park areas in a different way than the traditional parking. We had 55-foot sidewalks on K Street and 35-foot sidewalks on First Street to do this. This area was where we included some of our first guidelines for incorporating LID into public space, and you can see they've been incorporated as a design feature in this one project up here in the upper left. Other images just show where we've used landscaping to screen graded vaults that are needed for electric transformers, or to include LID at the curb. and narrowing the sidewalks so that we've got green space along our residential buildings. So today, NOMA, it's really starting to take shape. You can see here along First Street, this is while it was under construction, but you can see that there's the 3 streetscapes that are shown on the left side of the street. They were installed by different developers, but they really fit together seamlessly. And the city's then coming through, and we're repaving the street, we're reconfiguring the intersections, and we're installing bike lanes. Together, so this is First Street of NOMA today, and the district agencies established the public space standards. We put the necessary review processes in place, and we work with the private sector to collaboratively build complete streets. Together, it may just be one block at a time, but both public and private sector are systematically building complete streets at a citywide scale. With that, I will turn it back to Ben.
Thanks very much. This is a really fascinating presentation and a great topic. And you know, I said to you before we started the presentation that I'd be going down to DC in the next couple of weeks, and I'm really looking forward to scouting out some of the exercises, some of the principles you've been talking about, especially coming in on the train to Union Station, looking at to see how NOMA is being transformed, and walking around the residential neighborhoods in around Capitol Hill, and now understanding how they got to be that way. It's going to be very cool to do that. We have a couple of questions. I'd like to start one off, actually, and you've all touched on this one way or another, but I wonder if you could answer it more explicitly. A lot of the concerns about complete streets are in response to the pedestrians and pedestrian safety. This is, I think, particularly important for people with disabilities, whether they're mobility disabilities or vision disabilities. So I wonder, to what degree have people with disabilities been involved in your planning processes or the regulatory processes as well? Do you get feedback from them? Are they active in the public participation in the the walking tours and the like?
I can speak from the planning side, and I'll use Move DC as an example because it's recent. But we went and presented a number of times to the regional access board and the representatives that participate on that board to go over Move DC with them and gather their input. And we also had a handicapped person who represented their group on our advisory committee. It was a committee made up of residents from all over the city. And so yes, we do try in the planning as we go out and plan different studies to make sure that we're hearing from people of all ages and abilities. And we say that we have to be sure that what we're putting in works for someone who's 8 years old and 80 years old and everyone in between at every ability.
Yeah, this is Chris. So I haven't worked much with the community in terms of ADA issues, but I have worked internally with our ADA coordinator. And when we're reviewing streetscape plans, there are a lot of things that have come up, and we have changed how we have reviewed plans or established standards based on the input that we get from them. And that can include even material specifications. So we have an exposed aggregate sidewalk that we've been using in NOMA, and we worked with the ADA coordinator to make sure that the surface, the roughness of the surface wasn't causing a problem for certain users with mobility issues. We've also established some spacing standards, particularly around parking meters or multi-space meters, to make sure that there's at least 3 foot clear on one side so that everyone can easily have access to it. And that was actually sort of a design solution because initially we were told, well, you have to have 3 foot clear all the way around it. And we were trying to minimize the amount of paving and increase impervious area for root zones for better tree canopy for street trees. So we negotiated a solution where as long as there's 3 feet clear on one side, that would provide the access that was really needed to get to things like parking meters or around streetlights, depending on what it was.
If I can just add one other thing we've done is gone with the NACDOS guidelines for the amount of time pedestrians have to cross the street, so that's recently been increased. That was just in the past 12 months.
That's great. Thank you. We do have some questions, so I'm going to start firing them at you. First off, and I think this would go to Chris, how long did the public space permit for the church take to get issued? And this is from Joel.
Well, the first time I pulled that slide together, I actually had the dates on it, and that was a little discouraging, so I took the dates off. But in all fairness, the amount of time it took to review that, it wasn't related to the process. It was more the timeline that the developer was working on. And because we met with them so early in the review process, they had time to make changes. So I would say it probably took maybe 18 months, but there were a lot of issues going on. The church it's in an historic district. There were some historic preservation design issues that needed to be addressed. But I think what's good for the process is that the public space issues are being designed as part of these other processes. So it's not like they went through all of these processes and then got at the end, and then that 18 months was tacked on at the end. It was really included in the development of the project from the beginning. But we have some public space applications that are on a much smaller scale that it takes a week or 2 weeks to work through an issue if there is an issue. Ideally, applicants come in with something that just complies with our regulations, and those are approved immediately over the counter.
Okay, and a follow-up on the church permit question from Leslie. How did the cost of the selected alternative for the church property compare to the original submission? Were there any discussions on the maintenance of the selected design versus the original design?
I don't know the specifics of the cost, but one of the arguments we actually use in terms of trying to get applicants to follow our standards is that it actually costs less because we're having them put in less paving and more landscaping material. So I'm not sure if it really costs more. Obviously there was a cost to the church. The biggest cost was probably having to redesign it to get the curb cut off of the alley. But if you're only at 10% or 30% design, that's going to be a much easier cost to address early on as opposed to coming in at 90% design. And then we're kind of stuck with what we've got, and we have to make the best that we can out of a situation.
And following on this theme, we have a question from Cheryl. How is maintenance of the increased green space handled? Are adjacent property owners expected to maintain it, and did you get any pushback on that?
They are expected to maintain it. That's part of our public space regulations that go back, like over 100 years. So it's just something that's expected of people to really be a good citizen. It's part of your civic responsibility to maintain that public space. It's no different than requiring a business to shovel a sidewalk in a snowstorm. If you're a resident and you have that space in the front, you're expected to maintain it. And it's got benefits to residents as well as the city.
And so this is kind of continuing in this theme. Question from Arthur: who pays for the pedestrian-friendly improvements in the green park area that is on private property? If the private sector, what triggers their cooperation, and who maintains it?
Well, for at least the projects that I was talking about, those are all being done by the private sector, and we're reviewing them through the public space permitting process. The city, particularly in the residential areas, the city's not going to go out and install a fence or install landscaping or beautification. That's usually something that the adjacent property owner is going to do, and whether it's in public space or whether it's in the building restriction area, those would be being done by the adjacent property owner. Sort of along that line, if you're a developer and you're doing an office building and you're doing something that complies with all of our standards, so you're putting in our standard sidewalk material, you're putting in our standard street trees, the city will maintain the paving material and the street trees. But when you start to do something beyond that, so if you want to put special paving, say at the entrance to an office building, that is not something that the city will maintain. So as part of your permit, you have to also complete a covenant of maintenance agreement that the city keeps on file.
So we have a question from Donna, who expresses great gratitude for your work in compiling all the regs and codes into one manual. And what she's asked is, and this really gets to the theme of this presentation, do you think we need to stop planning for complete streets, or is it so integrated in DC that you don't feel like you're planning for it anymore? And consistent with that, we have a request from Tex to talk a little more about the trade-offs of complete streets.
So I would say that our complete streets or complete networks are still needed. The regulations that Chris had discussed don't really talk about the use of the space, particularly within the between curb to curb. And so in order to get bike lanes, whether they're protected cycle tracks or sharrows, that comes out of the more complete streets, complete networks, rather than what our public space guidelines provides at this point.
Okay, a question on LID. Have you had any difficulty effectively implementing LID rain gardens in heavily developed and historically developed areas, particularly with subsurface compaction and the resulting lack of permeability causing water to stand long term? And that comes to us from Greg.
Chris may be able to add more to this, but I would say generally some of our bigger projects are still relatively new. The Georgia Avenue Great Street project is, I think, one of the first ones that was done, and that was only 5 years ago. So we haven't gone through a substantial amount of time, the whole life cycle of it to see. We're still kind of in the maintenance and the weeding part of it. Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to say specifically to compaction, that hasn't so much been an issue because we have to dig out so much to put the LID in that anything that would be compacted has been removed and the new soil that's put back in place is what we would want it to be. I'd say the biggest challenge we have in terms of what's already in public space is working around our existing infrastructure, and that is water lines, gas lines, and underground electric lines. That's been the biggest challenge. We're just undertaking a project now on 19th Street in the downtown area, south of DuPont Circle, if you're familiar with DC. It's an entirely built out part of the central business district, but it's got 30-foot wide sidewalks. So what we've done through a grant from our local council of governments is we went to 30% design on a project to see where we could remove paving within that 35-foot sidewalk to create more LID. Again, this was in an area that doesn't have much parkland, so we were trying to green the street to bring more usable green space as well as address LID issues. And one of the first things that we did as part of that project that we included in our contract was to have utility line survey done so that we knew where we could put the LID in and work around the existing infrastructure that was there, and that really helped set the stage for what we ended up with as a final design.
So from Derek, we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to combine them into one. How are bus stops integrated into the street fabric and taxi stands as well in high trip-generating land use areas?
Well, I'll answer about the bus stops, because this is one of the things that when we first started having these PDRM meetings with developers and we were having all the different agencies come together, bus stops would come up frequently because we were trying to fit them in between street trees. We didn't want to have vulnerable populations standing waiting for a bus on a 90-degree day. So it was really important for us to make sure that we were having street trees where the bus stops were, which was in direct conflict to what the transit people and what what our transit agency wanted. So we figured out that what the buses really want is a 30-foot length of paving, so that's a distance long enough that will include both the front door to the bus and the back door of the bus. And then if you have tree boxes on either side of that 30 feet, we have a lot of standards. But anyway, we try to get trees to be 30 to 40 feet from each other so that the tree canopy will touch. Within that 40 feet, you can put that 30-foot bus pad and still have 5 feet between the edge of the tree box and before the center of the tree, so we get our 40 feet. That's a lot of numbers, but it does work out. That's for buses. And the question was also about taxi stands. We don't have taxi stands in DC that I know of.
They just kind of queue in different places.
I mean, Union Station, but that's private.
Yeah, we have them at our train station, but they just pull up out front. There's a whole queuing line for that. We have Uber, but that doesn't help answer.
Have you experienced any special hurdles or difficulties working in low-income neighborhoods?
Yeah, in what aspect would that be?
Well, it's a general question.
So, in my experience, there's some skepticism when we go into lower income neighborhoods to put bike lanes in. It's a group that I don't think has been catered to in terms of bicycle education. That said, there have been nonprofit groups popping up that are educating. That we have Black Women Bike is one organization run by Veronica Davis here in the District of Columbia that's going in and educating and getting more people accustomed to biking, not just for recreation but for getting around. And I think we are making strides as we are going in and putting in more bike facilities. There's a better understanding, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Then it starts the ball rolling on getting more people to use it. And in fact, at a recent meeting, the question that I heard was, well, you put bike share here, but there's no bike lane, so come back and include some bike lanes. So I thought that was going in the right direction for sure.
And I would say from a permitting standpoint, and I guess I wouldn't associate this specifically with low-income neighborhoods, but we have some applicants that come in that have their lawyers and their architects and fancy plans, and you work with them one way to get changes to their plans. You have other applicants that may be homeowners or small businesses, and they're just trying to put in a sidewalk cafe or put in a fence. And how you approach them and deal with them and what you may need to do to help them get through the application process is going to be different.
So then this question is a little bit of an extension of that last one, but on a different end of the spectrum. How much pushback do regulators in DC get from people who want to use their cars without the greatest ease? In particular, this being DC, politicians. How do they feel about complete streets?
So I would say generally that the reason why we're doing this and the reason we're trying to give people more transportation choices are so that people will be self-selective and willing to try something different. And that will enable the people who need or really want to stay in their car to be able to do so. With the growth that we've experienced and are anticipating, people won't be able to drive their cars like they can now unless some of the population is selecting other methods of transportation. And that's just the way it is. It's a limit of space and area.
So we have a question from Cheryl that is more of a, may draw on your experience in trying to apply this to other communities. And she asks, how would a community that doesn't have a good grid system, as DC does, effectively implement a complete networks approach?
Yeah.
So this is Andy. I'll talk to some. That issue comes up a lot with suburban retrofit projects, and not just retrofit projects in an area where you have a whole bunch of parallel streets that could be considered a grid. But it goes back to the opening of the presentation where you have to think about the philosophy of your design, and you have to stand firm on how important the design philosophy is within engineering and public works department. So everyone's number one priority is safety. In any state that you work in, your state DOT and then your local DOTs, their number one priority is safety. So that's absolutely consistent with complete networks and complete streets, because we're trying to keep people safe out in the public space. So we know from decades of data that designing streets in our communities that are for high-speed car traffic only, or to really prioritize that at the expense of walking and biking, we know that's dangerous for everyone. And it's not just people walking, it's the number one killer of kids and teenagers. So when you're looking at a place that doesn't have a great grid, whether it's a small town or it's another city or it's a suburb, you have to start with that design philosophy and get planning and engineering on the same page in terms of how you want to approach your streets. And then it's things like what Colleen mentioned about being in the city with politicians and even the upper class. At some point, there's only so much space. So not everybody is going to get their way. So same thing in the suburbs. Those streets in the suburbs are not intended to get you from your home, or every single resident from their home to the grocery store driving 60 miles an hour with 0 stops. If it's just physically impossible for every single resident to have that exact same experience. And so there are trade-offs at every level. There's trade-offs about how many people are in an area and how fast those cars should drive, and then what if the development is close enough to residential areas, is there an opportunity for people to bike? And so what we're seeing all over the country right now is places that aren't considered big cities or planning-centric cities. We're seeing cold weather places, hot weather places, a mix of climates, all looking for ways to give people options to walk around and make bike trips that are short trips. So that when you do those kinds of things to set up options for those small and local trips, then it frees up your public space to be able to do other things.
Okay, so we have two similar questions from Joel and Catherine, so I'm going to kind of merge them together. And they deal with questions of enforcement. You talked a little bit about the agreement that you have the private property owner sign. But are there other mechanisms that you use for enforcement of the use and maintenance of the parkway? And do you have any problems with the quality of landscaping and issues of, say, private irrigation systems?
I can speak a little bit to the enforcement issue, and yes, I think it is. I think we just don't have enough resources within our enforcement agencies to keep up with all the land area. And you can see that in, people complain about cars speeding and there's not enough MPD out there, or cars parking for longer than they're supposed to. But it's interesting because it really is at the forefront. Our DC Council has been debating a bill to make it an enforceable law that people have to shovel their sidewalks after snow. And it's been something that the city has told people they have to do, and it just hasn't been adhered to very well. And I believe it passed. It was just under discussion last week. It did pass. Chris is shaking his head, yes.
For elderly.
Yes, with exemptions for elderly and disabled. So enforcement is definitely a big issue, and it's about to get even bigger if we're going to see some snow this winter.
Snow in D.C. How about that? Question from Jason. In departing from complete streets, he asks, it seems that you feel that every street must accommodate cars and pedestrians, and that the system notion really is more applies to bikes and transit. Is that the intention, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think that's one way to look at it. We acknowledge the fact that the roads have vehicles on them. We're not trying to take vehicles off roads, and also the importance of deliveries. No one wants the UPS truck going down their street all the time, but they're also ordering on Amazon a couple of times a week and getting those deliveries. Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't remember off the top of my head how many miles of bike lanes we have installed, but through Move DC, we're proposing 220 new miles of bike facilities. So I think as we're prioritizing the pedestrian, and why we're saying then to add one other element to it, remember that's a protected element or a dedicated bus lane. So it's still going to help benefit other users as well.
My son lives in Brooklyn, New York, and so I drive down periodically to visit with him. And the last time I went down, I was driving along some side streets and was surprised and delighted to see dedicated bike lanes with bicyclists using them. This seems to be more and more common, especially as people are seeking alternate modes of getting around. A question from Matthew, and this is how often are your, and this may reflect the church example, how often are your recommendations to narrow the sidewalk, especially with the growing population in DC that may need more sidewalk space?
Is it to narrow or to widen?
It says to narrow, yes. Because in the church example, it looks like you narrowed the available sidewalk.
I'd say more often than not, we're asking people to narrow sidewalks because we have standards that set how wide a sidewalk needs to be based on what the neighborhood context is. So for our most low-density neighborhoods, we have a minimum of a 6-foot wide sidewalk. For medium to higher density residential neighborhoods, it's 8 feet, and then for commercial areas outside of downtown, it's a 10-foot clear sidewalk, and then for our downtown, it's 16 feet. So we have established a minimum, well, and I guess maximum widths. And I guess as I'm answering this, there are cases where we do have to ask applicants to widen sidewalks. They may just say they want to do a 6-foot, but it's in an area where our standards are 8 or 10. So I don't know if we do one more than the other. It is something that comes up almost in every application, unless it's a developer who we've worked with a lot, who has a lawyer or an architect or a team that knows what our standards are.
And from Derek, are there any special standards for intermodal transfer locations that involve a mix of different modes, say bikes and buses, trains, pedestrians, to ensure some sort of comprehensive compatibility and safety?
Can you ask that again?
Sure. Are there special standards for intermodal transfer locations, that involve a mix of different modes, such as bikes, buses, trains, pedestrians, to ensure comprehensive compatibility and safety? I guess safety being the bottom line.
Sure. We don't have that right now, but I can see us moving toward that in the near future as we develop more of these centers. We're getting there right now. One example is Union Station, and the fact that it's almost at capacity, not only with the commuter rail, Amtrak, but also the metro at that spot. So we're going to have to develop some regulations, but at this point, there's not many to speak of.
No, and I guess I'd say I think the basic regulations that we have that apply citywide, we've been able to use in these transit hubs, and one I'm thinking at the Petworth Metro Station, which is on a green line, but there's also a lot of it's also a bus hub. So there's a number of bus bays along the street right outside the entrance to the metro station. And it was all that bus bay area was being redeveloped as part of an adjacent property that was a new mixed-use building with ground floor retail and residential above it. And when they first came in, they had a whole row of bus shelters and maybe 3 trees. And we said, well, we have these basic streetscape standards that establish minimums for trees, and so we worked with them through that process to make sure that there were trees between every bus shelter. And I can't remember what we got it up to, but I think it may have gone from 3 to 5 trees up to 10 trees. So I would say we didn't have special standards that we used in that situation, but we did have our basic standards that we used and were really helpful.
Well, great. We are now at 2:30, and this is the end of the webcast. I want to thank our speakers, Andy Bayno, Colleen Hawkinson, and Chris Shaheen, for this terrific presentation. I know I learned a lot, which makes it so much more fun to moderate. For those of you who are still tuned in, I just want to go through a few reminders. First, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, you can go to planning.org/CM, select today's date, the 21st of November 2014, select today's webcast, which is It Time to Stop Planning Complete Streets, sponsored by the New Urbanism Division. You can also search for it by the event number, which is 28898. This concludes today's session, and I want to thank everyone for attending.